We repeat what we don't repair. And I've heard that statement before. It's really logical, but it wasn't until I started working with children that it really had an impact. And if you look at the picture here on why restorative practices is a situation, a program, and it's by a group of people, the Maori people that you see here pictured, that talk about healing in a community. And not only talk about healing in a community, but about problem solving as well. And so I'm currently working on my EDD in educational leadership at Miami University. And I talked about practices the entire time. Restorative practices. Oh, when you get students together, you should have them talk about what happened if there's a discipline issue or situation that occurred in the building. Oh, and what were you thinking? And why did this happen? But I recently had a class, and it was called Curriculum, Pedagogy, and Diversity. And in this particular class, we dug a little bit deeper. And as we dug a little bit deeper, we started thinking about why. I started reading a lot about the Maori people, wondering, how is it that someone could be murdered in your family, a husband, and the woman would adopt the person who actually committed the crime? And so with that being said, I began to dig a little deeper. And digging a little deeper, finding out, why do you care? How do you care? And why do you care? And if you're an educator, why is that important in education? And so in doing so, I found a theorist. His name is Sylvan Tompkins. And Sylvan Tompkins came up with a theory. He's a psychologist. This was in the 1920s. And we'll move to the next slide so that you can see what these images are on that next slide about Sylvan Tompkins' work. And he said every single human being, every single infant is born with 9 different emotions. That's you, and you, and you. And those emotions are startle, are fear, interest, anger, distress, joy, and laughter. And if you look there, it's the density of the neural firing. And so what does all of that mean? 2 of them are missing. And the 2 that are not on this chart are so critical to restorative practices and why it works and how it works to an educator. And so what that means is dismal is missing and shame. Is shame universal? Is a question that I begin to ask as well. I'm only a year into the program, and I'll continue to research and to discover, is that something that drives students within a community? And so in his work, he also discovered that every single human being wants to hear positive words, wants to hear positive comments. And when we hear something negative, that neural firing causes all of these other emotions to come to the forefront. So what does that have to do with education? Why is it important? What do I do in my role as an assistant principal? Well, I'll show you on the next slide. The next slide is my why. This is me. You'll see the yellow arrow. Of course, I'm not looking forward like everyone else because I'm always that kid wondering why. I'm looking to see who's running the camera. Where's everyone else? I don't remember much about this picture, but what I will tell you is I was born in Brooklyn, New York City. And for 10 years, before this picture was taken, along with these other students from every nationality, every ethnicity that you could even imagine, it was the first time in the 1970s that I was bussed out to a school where they hadn't seen people like me, where teachers didn't work with people like me. And I was a handful. And when I mean a handful in my community, there were behaviors that were accepted. However, the way that they treated me in that community was that I wasn't a bad person, but I made bad choices and there were wrongdoings that I had. And so fast forward a couple of years, I stayed with these people. There's only one person that I remember in this picture, and that's the person who is to the left, I think your left in the picture as well. That's Maria Campanella. And Mrs. Fisherman that particular year made me feel valued. She let me know that I was worthy of being in this school. And so Maria and I, we competed with spelling anti-disestablishmentarianism. I had no idea what it meant. I looked it up like 5 times, still didn't know, but I spelled that word right, and I beat Maria Campanella that year. I also learned that I was an artist that year. Interestingly, even though I'm a 6th through 12th grade assistant principal at Princeton, it was the first time I drew my Viking ship, and it was so detailed. And I said, Mrs. Fisherman, look at what I could do. And she said, oh my gosh, did you have a ruler? I said, no, I didn't have a ruler. She said, I know, because you've got one for life, because I'm double jointed. And I have this finger that I will always think of Mrs. Fisherman because this measures exactly an inch. And it was something on me that I would take for a lifetime. She was doing restorative practices and didn't know it. And so on that next slide, you'll see, fast forward many years later, this is what many of our schools are doing. There's a difference between restorative practices and traditional practices. Traditional practices deal with students coming from all kinds of backgrounds, all kinds of ethnicities. And those teachers, those adults who provide these opportunities for traditional practices are stifling our students academically. So what does that mean? School rules are violated, accountability is defined as punishment, and then lastly, at the very bottom, which is why this is a passion for me, there's no opportunity for the offender to say, I'm remorseful, I have shame about what I did. So this is why I do the work. This is why I'm working on the doctorate. Because in restorative practices, the key here, if you look and see, is that it's about people and relationships. Relationships, 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 and connectivity. I bet each one of you sitting here right now can think of a teacher that did something positive for you, that did something that lit your world up. And so one of the experiences that I had in my experience as an assistant principal in a previous district, a teacher sent a student to the office. She had on a tam, she had braids. It was a predominantly white community. And so this young African-American lady came to me and she was gonna be suspended for 5 days. Well, the principal, who I simply adored, said, this really isn't equitable, Malinda. We need to do something different. What do we do different? I said, I don't know, send her in my office, we'll figure it out. So she came into my office, and as she was in my office, I said, can you take your hat off, please? No, I'm not taking it off. I said, you are. Take your hat off, please. Nope, I'm not taking it off. Can you take your hat off, please, for me? So eventually, the young African-American lady did behind closed doors, and some of her braids were coming out. And in that moment, I had some supplies in my office, and I began to braid. She allowed me to braid her hair. She allowed me to put her back together. I kept the hat until the end of the day. I thought I did a really good job, too, when I made her, fixed her hair. And so she left, went in the restroom, came back out. Of course, she changed it. But I hope that she remembers that experience for her entire lifetime, that she was going to be punished for something traditionally, which we as human beings, being connected, just like Tompkins Sylvan said, it's about relationships. And then it's also about the stimulus that's in the community. And with that stimulus, what do we do to make things better for human beings rather than punish them for making poor choices? And so on the next slide, as we move along, I'll share with you also, this is McCold and Watchell. I discovered this in my research as well. So it's simple, it's easy if you look at the diagram there. The goal is to get into the blue. It's the with restorative, no matter what relationships we have. And with that, the goal is to have high support and also low control. But unfortunately, in our school systems, we have very high control with low support. So I challenge people wherever I go, let's do things differently. Let's look at this social window, social discipline window, and make things a more positive experience for students every single day that they walk into the building. Just like there are many teachers I'm certain I could mention that have done that for me. And so moving on to the next slide, as we talk about what is restorative practices, I will share with you lastly, it's a check-in, it's a check-out, it's a circle up. How often do you get a chance to share your feelings, share your emotions? If you do something wrong, how do you know if you're shamed about it, if you're not taught? The research shows, unfortunately, that 15% of students are African American in this country. Here's what's alarming. Here's what hasn't changed. Of those 15%, 35% of African Americans have been suspended once. Twice, 44%. And 36% of those students have been expelled. And the students that have special needs are not far behind. So what are we going to do differently? I challenge each and every one of you listening to this, whether you're an educator, whether you're a student, whether you work in the community or a board member, how do we begin to do things differently and restore practices that are in the school system? How do we make our community positive? How do we repair harm? How do we teach children to have a voice, to have the language, to know to do things differently? Every single adult has the ability to understand. Every student, every single adult has the ability to regulate emotions so that we can have a safer community, create a welcoming place. And every single child deserves to have a trusting adult, someone they can go to that makes them feel valued, that makes them want to be here. Just like the Maori people, everyone makes mistakes. And unless we implement, and I will fight to tooth and nail, restorative practices for all students to make learning equitable, to make access to all things, we will continue to repeat what we don't repair. Thank you.